The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Hey, Rachel. I know we love your blue sky.
I know. I don't know if it's possible for anybody to love blue sky as much as I do at this point. I mean, it's just a social media entity, but the relief at not being in the evil place anymore, it gives it really a serious synapse boost in terms of how much I'm interested in being there.
The water is warm. It's like a tub with hot springs. People can have a conversation. Join us.
Yes. Even when people are reaming you out on blue sky, they're at least doing so without invoking Hitler tropes. You know what I mean?
Correct.
It's a nicer environment.
Threatening to kill your children. Exactly. I prefer it. Exactly.
We have a low bar for what constitutes happiness at this point, but I hear you. Thank you, my friend. Much appreciated. I will make sure that I'm following all your stuff. All right. And thanks to At Home for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here this Monday night. They said that by nightfall, the turnout was somewhere north of 325,000 people. Look at the size of this. We knew in advance that this was going to be a big demonstration. The government knew it was coming. The government had parked a whole bunch of tractors around their Capitol building in anticipation that there were going to be a lot of people there, and they thought the wall of tractors might put people off, I guess. All through that afternoon, Saturday afternoon, you could see the crowd starting to build up in the capital city. But when they ended up at night at something like 325,000 people in the streets, I think pretty much everybody was surprised. This happened Saturday in Serbia, in a country that's only got about 6.6 million people. They got 1/3 of a million people to show up at a single demonstration when they don't even have 7 million people in the entire country for their population. If you want to compare that to us, if we got a similar proportion of our country's population to all show up for the same demonstration, that would be a demonstration of about 17 million people. Yeah, this is just massive. This was Belgrade this weekend. Serbia's president is pro-Putin and pro-Trump. The people of Serbia are not, and they are mobilizing in almost unbelievable numbers now to try to get rid of their president. These are the biggest protests that have happened in that country in a generation. Absolutely massive. President Donald Trump's son, Don Jr., the brunette, he visited Serbia last week and said that he thought the protests there were artificial, that they weren't real. The real Serbian people certainly wouldn't be protesting against their leadership. The Serbian president posted photos of himself with Don Jr., like he was greeting a head of state or something. The Serbian president also ordered police in that country to raid the offices of 4 of the major civil society NGOs in that country. The police went in without warrants. They went in armed. And they just took everything at those organizations. The justification for them doing that was Donald Trump. Trump is trying to abolish USAID, trying to close down America's foreign aid agency. In so doing, Trump's top campaign donor, Elon Musk, called USAID a criminal organization. Remember when he said that? That has had consequences. Serbia's government is deciding that they're taking that literally. Well, it's Donald Trump's top campaign donor saying they're criminals. They're taking that literally and essentially operating now on the assumption, or at least on the pretext, that any organization that ever got any support from USAID must be a criminal organization. And so now they've got armed police raids and shutting those organizations down and the threat of, in fact, criminal charges. That said, the people of that country in absolutely massive numbers would seem to disagree. What's going on in that country started as a group of students protesting against corruption and its consequences. In November, there was a disaster at a Serbian train station. The concrete roof of a train station in Serbia collapsed and it killed 15 people. And that might not sound like a political event, but it has sparked this huge political movement because students, after that disaster, took to the streets and said, reasonably, that the reason that train station roof was improperly built and it therefore collapsed is because the government is corrupt. And that's the kind of construction you get when the only criteria for getting a government contract is cronyism and bribery instead of actually knowing how to do the work. That is the kind of accident you get when your terrible train station construction passes inspection and opens up to the public, not because it's actually safe or properly built, but because the necessary bribes were paid. Corrupt countries, oligarchic countries, autocratic countries are lousy countries. Bad governance means bad standards of living, means bad economies, means worse lives for everybody except the people at the very top. And these students started demonstrating against their Putin and Trump-style corrupt government in November. And now they are turning out hundreds of thousands of people in the streets of their capital. And it is very possible that that government will fall, despite a friendly visit from Don Jr. Another 50,000 people turned out in Hungary this weekend. Look at this. To protest against the Trump and Putin-aligned dictator in that country, Viktor Orban. Look at this crowd in Budapest on Saturday. Viktor Orban is the tool that Vladimir Putin is using to try to break apart the EU. Viktor Orban has also provided the Trump movement in this country with much of its playbook for what they're doing to our country and to our government right now, firing as many civil servants as they can, discrediting, attacking, intimidating, ultimately trying to co-opt all of the media, attacking and trying to close down colleges and universities, discrediting and attacking judges and the court system. That is all Viktor Orban's playbook. And the Trump movement credits him with all those good ideas, which they are now trying to put in place in the United States. Viktor Orban has been in power in his country for 15 years now. He has turned his country into an autocracy, and although his family and his friends have become very, very, very rich, Hungary's economy is also trash now for everyone else. And so Hungary, in large numbers, Hungarians are turning out in shockingly large numbers against him and in support of a rising opposition party that very well may beat him and remove him from office if he allows the next rounds of elections to happen in Hungary. Also this weekend in Romania and in the nation of Georgia, there were more huge anti-Putin, pro-Europe, large-scale protests. Russia is accused in Romania of not only interfering in their last election, but also just outright trying to mount a military coup to oust the government there, to instead install a pro-Russian, pro-Putin puppet regime. Vice President J.D. Vance has taken up Russia's talking points against the Romanian government, criticizing them, while the EU has taken steps to try to help Romania defend itself against Putin. In the nation of Georgia, they also have a pro-Putin, pro-Russia authoritarian government, even though much of the population of that country wants Georgia to be part of Europe instead. The opposition in Georgia, the pro-European, pro-Western opposition in Georgia has mounted increasingly large demonstrations in their capital city. They've actually done a large-scale demonstration in their capital city every single day for the last 110 days. Today was day 110. They are protesting the government itself. They've, interestingly, and I think importantly, been protesting against state TV, which is just relentless Russian-style propaganda now. But they're mounting those demonstrations in the nation of Georgia 110 straight days now and counting. Lest you feel like we're all alone here. We've got plenty of company. And they're doing it in massive, unified protests over there, particularly in huge numbers this weekend. Here, we're doing it mostly in widely dispersed protests all over the place, all the time. Some of them large, some of them small. This was Boise, Idaho, at the state capitol on Saturday. Deep, deep, deep red Idaho. Look at this. Thousands of people turned out in Boise on Saturday protesting against Trump, protesting against Trump and what he and his top campaign donor are doing to the U.S. government. This was in Lower Manhattan this weekend, what they call a die-in. Thousands of people protesting what Trump and Musk are doing and their threats to things like Medicaid and Medicare that tens of millions of Americans rely upon. Protests against Trump and his top campaign donor are everywhere. People in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and in Olympia, Washington this weekend, protesting at their state capitol buildings in support of veterans and against Trump's cuts to the VA. People in Kansas City, Missouri this weekend, Save the Civil Service. People in Reno, Nevada this weekend, outside the office of Republican Congressman Mark Amaday. And like I said, some of these protests are big. More big protests this weekend in Boston on Saturday, in Tarrytown, New York, where they said courage is contagious this weekend. But some of these protests are small, too, which actually shows its own kind of courage. Little protests, little sort of sparky, spunky protests this weekend in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, and in Canton, Ohio. Even after President Trump and his top campaign donor and the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, all started threatening Americans who don't support Elon Musk's car company. They started threatening people that they'd be hit with terrorism charges, or that these, boycotting Tesla or protesting against Tesla was somehow specially illegal in a way that other forms of protests aren't, which is nonsense legally, but they issued the threats anyway. Even after those threats last week from Trump, from Musk, from Attorney General Pam Bondi, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of protests at Tesla dealerships all over the country this weekend. There was a big one in Tucson, Arizona, another big one in Pasadena, California, another one in Seattle, Washington. But they were everywhere, from Golden Valley, Minnesota, to Santa Rosa, California, to Loveland, Colorado, to Cleveland, Ohio, to Austin, Texas, to South Burlington, Vermont. Protesters all over the country with this simple and now defiant message, just asking people simply, if you drive a Tesla, please sell it. And if you own stock in Tesla, please dump it. Elon Musk is not a government official, right? He was never elected. And so this is the way people are trying to protest against Elon Musk and his role in our government. We saw constituents of Republican Congressman Lloyd Smucker turn out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania this weekend. They held essentially a mock town hall in the name of Congressman Smucker. Since he won't hold any real ones with his actual constituents, they did it for him. Same thing in Arizona. Tucson area constituents of Republican Congressman Juan Ciscomani held a big town hall in his name because he won't meet with his constituents now at all, and so they met without him. They saved him a seat. We also saw big and, frankly, angry demonstrations for Mahmoud Khalil and other permanent residents or people with valid visas who have nevertheless been arrested or deported. You've seen the 5-alarm constitutional fire Trump set this weekend by appearing, at least, to defy a court order when he chose to disappear several hundred men out of the country without any legal process at all, apparently on the pretext that Trump can use wartime powers, even though we're not at war. I say this was a 5-alarm constitutional fire. There was over this matter, there was a big showdown on this in court this evening. Tonight, here live, we're going to be talking with the lawyer who got the court order that should have turned around those planes this weekend. It's the same lawyer who was arguing the case in court tonight. We're going to be speaking with him live just after that court hearing in just a moment. You're going to want to see that. But before we get to that, and that is an urgent story, there's one other story that is breaking just tonight. It's just broken. It's just developed sort of within the past couple of hours. And I want to bring this to you first. I'm not sure you've seen this elsewhere. You might remember a couple of weeks ago, we covered here on this show a sort of, in the grand scheme of things, a small-scale confrontation in one small government office in Washington. It's a little agency that you definitely haven't heard of. It's called the U.S. Africa Development Foundation. And the reason we covered what was going on there is because something unusual happened there when Trump went after that office, went after that agency and tried to shut them down. At that agency, they had a physical confrontation with people from Doge, from the Elon Musk austerity group. These would-be anonymous young men who work for Elon Musk. They showed up. Do you remember the story? They showed up at that small government agency and they demanded to be let inside. And that small government agency told them no. They said, We're an independent agency. We are actually not part of the executive branch. You have no legal authority over us. You have no legal right to come in. We do not invite you in. We say you can't come in. You cannot come in. And the Doge kids left when they were told they couldn't come in. But then the next day they came back with muscle. They came back with people who said they were U.S. Marshals. And we think those people were possibly armed. They were carrying guns. Now, the U.S. Marshal Service consistently will not comment on this. They will not say whether or not those people were actually U.S. Marshals. We have some reporting that suggests they may not have been U.S. Marshals. Nevertheless, they reportedly claimed to be U.S. Marshals. And with those men, with those people claiming to be U.S. Marshals, the young men from Doge did physically force their way into that agency and then locked out all the actual staff and changed the locks. So whether or not your heartstrings are pulled by the fate of that individual agency, right? You can see why this might be a qualitatively more worrying thing than some of the other stuff we have seen. I mean, there are legitimate legal disputes as to whether this Doge group has any legal authority over some of these agencies that they're trying to get into so they can take over their systems and fire their staff and shut them down. Those disputes are legal disputes that need to be sorted out legally. You can't just use guns to force your way in the meantime, as a means of settling that dispute. If there's a legal dispute as to whether or not you are allowed in a U.S. government building, and you cast that aside and say, we've got guns, and that's the grounds on which we're coming in, what that is an armed assault on the U.S. government. That is an armed assault on a U.S. government office. That's a break-in. That's call the cops territory. That's barricade the doors territory. I mean, at that point, what's to stop the little government agency from bringing in their own armed force, right? And then we shoot it out? That said, if there is an armed part of the U.S. government, somebody who's allowed, whose agents are allowed to carry weapons, who have badges, who are allowed to use physical force as part of their job, it's the U.S. Marshals or anyone else. If they are now working for Doge against other parts of the government that you might think have an equal claim to their services and protection, well, then if that's the case, Doge is something different than we thought it was. Do they have an army? I mean, if the president has given his top campaign donor the ability to use physical force, the ability to use the force of arms against other parts of the U.S. government, we are in a different place than we thought we were. Worrying possibilities were raised by that conflict at the U.S.-Africa Development Foundation when that unfolded a couple of weeks ago. That's why we covered it here on this show when it happened. That led last week to a lawsuit being filed against the U.S. Marshals. Democracy Forward filed this lawsuit last week, asking in part why, quote, individuals associated with Doge have repeatedly invoked threats to engage the U.S. Marshal Service when seeking questionable access to agency buildings and information. So that happened at the U.S. Africa Development Foundation a couple of weeks ago, led to the lawsuit against the U.S. Marshals, demanding information from the Marshals last week. Well, now tonight, it has led to another physical confrontation. And this time, the agency in question actually did call the cops. In this case, it's something called the U.S. Institute of Peace. It works on things like research in conflict zones and training future diplomats. It was created by Congress during the Reagan administration. It was created in 1984. But it is not an official part of the U.S. government. It does not act in the name of the U.S. government. It is a separate institution. Nevertheless, on Friday, representatives from Doge showed up unannounced at their building. And they showed up unannounced, this time not with somebody claiming to be a U.S. Marshal. This time they showed up with FBI agents? Wait, the FBI works for Doge? They demanded entry into the U.S. Institute of Peace. The Doge team was reportedly met by lawyers for the Institute who informed them, quote, of the Institute's private and independent status as a non-executive branch agency. They told them they could not come in. The Doge representatives on Friday then departed. That was Friday. But now, today, apparently it has come to a different ending. We got this alarming quote from the CEO of that independent organization tonight. Quote, "Doge has broken into our building." The New York Times reports, quote, "The U.S. Institute for Peace called the D.C. police on the Musk team members in an effort to stop them from trespassing because the Institute has control of its own building and the land it sits on. But instead, the D.C. police allowed them to enter and kicked out the Institute's officials." FBI agents, reportedly, and the local police are being used by one government agency as an armed force against another part of the government, another government agency that controls its own building and that says you can't come in. What's going on here? And how do we figure it out? Joining us now is somebody who has been trying to pry loose some of the truth of what's going on here. Skye Perryman is the president and CEO of Democracy Forward, which sued the U.S. Marshal Service last week, asking why Doge was repeatedly invoking the marshals while trying to force their way into various buildings in Washington. Ms. Perryman, thanks very much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So we've been trying to follow this as it has been unfolding. It sort of dribs and drabs, and now this dramatic unfolding tonight. Let me just ask if there's anything that you know about this that either contradicts what I just said or can further advance the story.
Well, I think what you said is concerning, and 5 alarm, I think is what you called it, as it is what we're hearing. We're hearing concerning reports tonight from people who have been inside the Institute of Peace. And this is really, unfortunately, a pattern. It sounds unbelievable. It sounds terrifying because it is, but this is becoming a pattern. We've seen this at other agencies, including the African Development Foundation, where we also have litigation pending against its on behalf of its chair, who, by the way, is a Republican, that is having to sue because the president is unlawfully removing him, and there was a confrontation. And now we have this, potentially armed confrontation today. This is not America, but this is what is happening in 2025.
The lawsuit that you've already filed concerning the Marshal Service,
Yes.
Are you seeking information from the Marshal Service as to whether or not their personnel have been seconded to Doge somehow? Are you trying to find out under what authority whoever those people were might have been operating when they used force to get into that property?
Yes, we actually have been trying to seek that information from the government under the Freedom of Information Act, which you've talked about on your show before, that entitles all Americans to have this information. And the government has refused to provide it. And so that's why we are now again in federal court seeking to have disclosure of communications, of documents. That's one of many cases that we have pending right now to get, to really understand what's happening with Doge, with Elon Musk. By the way, because no one voted for Elon Musk or for this, this sort of force.
I know that Democracy Forward, that your organization is involved in a lot of litigation against the president and Doge and what they're doing to try to dismantle the government. I do want to ask, though, if there is precedent for this type of controversy, this type of dispute. I feel like when I cover things in other countries, one of the things I watch for to try to understand what kind of country that is when physical force is used to settle legal or political disputes, when guys with guns show up in the middle of what I would otherwise expect to be something that was a subject of a, summons. I don't know of anything else like this before. I profess I might be ignorant to this part of D.C. dramatic history. But do you know of any precedent for something like this, for one part of the government using armed physical force against another?
This is completely unprecedented. And when you talk to experts that study societies that are in decline, democracies that are in decline, you find these kind of skirmishes between different parts of the government, sometimes with force. And so it's highly concerning this is happening in the United States in 2025. That is why our team at Democracy Forward, of course, is in court every day, challenging these actions, trying to help the American people figure out what is going on with their own government. But this is quite concerning and unprecedented.
Skye Perryman, President and CEO of Democracy Forward. You are a very, very, very busy woman, and this is a very busy organization that you are running. Thank you for taking time out tonight to help us understand this. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, more news ahead here tonight. Stay with us. So tonight we are right in the middle of a very important clash between the Trump administration and the courts. And it has been rapidly developing and escalating over the past 48 hours or so. As we talked about on Friday night's show, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 is a law that is a wartime law in this country. It's used during wartime only. The last time it was used was during World War II, when it was used to put Japanese Americans in internment camps, something for which the U.S. government later apologized and paid reparations under Ronald Reagan. Nevertheless, in an unannounced written statement this weekend, Donald Trump claimed that that was the law he would use as the basis for deporting people who he determined to be members of a Venezuelan gang. He would use that law to deport people immediately, without any due process or any legal consideration at all. Organizations, including the ACLU, sued immediately to block him from using that 1700s law. The chief judge of the Washington, D.C. Federal District Court held an emergency hearing on the ACLU's lawsuit late Saturday afternoon. And at that hearing, the ACLU's lawyer, Lee Gallant, told that judge that it was his understanding that planes were about to take off, or possibly had taken off during the hearing, carrying hundreds of men out of this country toward a prison in El Salvador. There was a Trump administration lawyer there representing the government. That lawyer said he couldn't give the judge any information about that at all. So again, this was an emergency hearing late on Saturday, and the judge ended up basically saying, listen, there are difficult questions of law here, and these are going to have to be worked out in the courts. For now, I am blocking the Trump administration from deporting people under this law from the 1700s. They are blocked from using this law as the basis for these deportations until we can hash out these legal questions. So the judge actually said to the Trump administration lawyer, quote, "You shall inform your clients," meaning inform the Trump administration, "of this immediately. You should inform them that any plane containing these folks that's going to take off or is in the air needs to be returned to the United States. Those people need to be returned to the United States." Quote, "This is something that you need to make sure is complied with immediately." By all appearances, that order was not complied with immediately. NBC News reports that 2 flights carrying these men were in transit when the judge issued his ruling, but they did not turn around. They continued on their way. The Washington Post reports that a 3rd plane was still on the ground at the time of that ruling. It hadn't taken off in Texas until after that judge's ruling had been issued. The next morning, the pro-Trump president of El Salvador announced that his country had accepted 238 men from the United States. He posted a slickly produced 3-minute propaganda video of some of these men being sort of manhandled and pushed around, and all of them having their heads shaved by armed Salvadoran military or security forces. President Trump happily posted the video as well. The president of El Salvador says these men will be jailed in a massive prison in his country for as many years as the U.S. wants to pay him to keep them there. They have not been charged with crimes and thereby sentenced to serve this time. They're just being locked up indefinitely at the pleasure of El Salvador. At the White House press briefing today, Trump's press secretary listed all the crimes these men ostensibly committed, but a senior Trump administration official tells NBC News that these men have not necessarily been convicted of any of these crimes. Still, though, they're in prison now in El Salvador indefinitely, having been disappeared out of this country with no process whatsoever. We don't even know who these guys are. They keep saying they're Venezuelan gang members. We don't even know if they're Venezuelans, let alone gang members. Unsurprisingly, the federal judge who held that hearing on Saturday, where he made it abundantly clear that nobody was supposed to be sent to El Salvador, he called a new hearing today to assess whether the Trump administration had knowingly violated his court order. Quote, "A federal judge pressed a Justice Department lawyer today over why the Trump administration did not comply with his order to temporarily halt deportations under an 18th century law, and asked why key information about the flights was being withheld over the weekend. In a tense hearing, the judge summarized the administration's position on his court order Saturday as, quote, "We don't care, we'll do what we want." Trump administration lawyer at this evening's hearing still refused to provide any information about the flights. And so the judge has now ordered another hearing for tomorrow at noon, at which the Trump administration must give him the information he wants or explain the legal rationale for why they are not giving it to him. And if they don't, then, well, then.
I love people who stand up to bullies. Joining me now for his first national interview since announcing his candidacy for Congress is Christian Menefee. Well, you've had quite a day. Thank you for joining me. So let me start by asking you this. I mean, you said it in your ad, and I know your history well. You've gone head-to-head with the governor of Texas and Trump in court many times, and you've won some of those times. There's obviously a frustration with Democrats in Washington right now. You'd be coming kind of from the outside. What would you do differently if you're elected?
Well, Jen, thank you very much for having me on tonight. What I've seen throughout the base in the state of Texas is that people want fighters. They want fighters at every level of government who are going to stand up to MAGA extremists as they work to roll back our rights. As Harris County Attorney, I've gone toe-to-toe with Greg Abbott, with Ken Paxton, with all the MAGA names that you think of when you think of Donald Trump. And time after time, we've won. We've delivered real results for people in the area of voting rights and ensuring that we have protecting clean air and clean water and in going after scammers. That's exactly what I want to bring to D.C. is that fighting spirit. We've seen Trump time after time cut off funding, critical programs, roll back rights, and I think that it's time that we stood up and fought in a meaningful way to deliver real results for the people we serve.
A lot of Democrats are, I think they're trying to figure out how to fight in the right way. Your fellow Houston Democrat, Congressman Al Green, was censured by House Republicans and actually 10 House Democrats after his protest during Trump's joint address. How did you feel about Congressman Green's approach to the joint session, and what would your strategy be in a moment like that?
I thought what Congressman Al Green did was incredibly Texas, because Texas Democrats know how to fight. We've been dealing with MAGA extremists for a very, very long time. We have been in the backyard, a place where people thought we would never be able to be competitive. And we saw in 2018, Beto O'Rourke came very, very close to flipping the entire state. What Congressman Green did was stand up and call out what is not right. And that's exactly what we need in D.C. And not just fighting for the purpose of fighting some sort of cosmetic battle, but on the issues that are important to people. When you have a president who is telling immigrants that even though their kids are born right here in the United States, that they're not citizens. When you have a president who is stepping in and cutting off trillions of dollars in federal programming, people want more than words. People want more than TikToks. People want more than tweets. They want someone who's going to stand up, who's going to fight, and who's going to deliver real results. And that's exactly what I hope to bring to Congress.
Governor Abbott has yet to schedule the election date in your race, I believe. Are you worried at all that he might delay the election to help Republicans keep their slim House majority?
I hope that Governor Abbott does not play politics with the people of the 18th Congressional District. Now, in 2 years, we've had 2 different periods where the people of the 18th Congressional District have not had representation. When we lost the late, great Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and now when we've lost former Mayor and Congressman Sylvester Turner. These were incredible public servants, and this